Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Say the word Europe these days and thoughts naturally turn to the crisis engulfing Greece, which recently received another bailout to stave off financial collapse and prevent financial contagion from rocking the entire European financial system. But looking beyond Greece, what impact is the crisis having on future plans for the EU to grow? Are its plans to expand further still looking solid given the Greek crisis? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Athanasios Manis. He's a PhD candidate at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Brendan Donnely is Director of Federal Trust, a pro-EU think tank. He's also a former MEP. And Robert Oulds is Director of the Bruges Group, a think tank that campaigns for a less centralised Europe. Robert, let me come to you first. Simple question. Is expansion, enlargement in the EU now effectively dead, at least for now?
Expansion of the European Union is very unlikely at the moment. Of course, they're taking in Croatia, but at this time being, the European Union is suffering economically. It can't be afford to be taking on other members, and really the divisions in the European Union are growing as a result of the EU's inspired austerity programmes, which are causing a great deal of harm amongst many nations' economies. So really expanding the EU isn't really an alternative, and countries that are outside of the European Union are generally better off than those countries within the European Union. So why countries would want to join is increasingly becoming less likely.
Though, to be fair, I doubt you would be arguing for EU expansion even if the economic circumstances were better.
Well, when there is an expansion of the European Union, there is always a further degree of centralisation. Some people in this country, in Britain, have often favoured an expansion of the EU, thinking that would be a less centralised EU. But what has actually happened whenever the EU expands, there is then more powers handed over to the institutions of Brussels, which are unelected and undemocratic.
Brendan Donnely, is the issue of expansion or enlargement effectively shelved now because of the crisis?
I think it's true that enlargement isn't dead, but it's pretty sickly. I think there's every chance that in the longer term, Serbia and possibly Montenegro will join the European Union. But I'm rather sceptical about any other countries. Turkey, I think, really will not join the European Union now. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that the difficulties, if you regard them as difficulties relating to enlargement, antedate the Eurozone crisis. I think the Eurozone crisis at the margin may have reinforced people's doubts within the European Union about expansion, about enlargement, but I think the decisive thing was Bulgaria and Romania joining. I think a lot of people in the European Union decided and concluded that had happened too quickly. That had an influence on Croatia. The Croatian accession negotiations took longer. So go back to my original point, a little more, I think, but not much in the way of expansion, but from a different set of reasoning from that which Robert's put forward.
Athanasios, is enlargement now effectively shelved?
I think this is a very good question, and politicians nowadays mostly tend to focus on the economic crisis and see it as a problem per se. But I do think that we have to ask ourselves about the ramifications that the Eurozone crisis has on EU enlargement. And I think that this is a difficult question, but let me start by saying that EU enlargement has two sides. It has the demand side and the supply side. The demand side is about the power of attraction of the EU. So what the EU tells to third countries, whether it is an aim or a goal that has to be achieved. And then the supply side, which has to do with whether the already EU member states want third countries to join the EU. So the question should be whether the Eurozone crisis has an impact on the demand and supply. And as far as the demand is concerned, I would say that to a certain extent that there is some kind, I suspect that there will be, if it's not still there, some kind of impact, considering that most of the third countries have been joining the EU, like from Central Eastern Europe, for its economic prosperity. On the other hand, we have the supply side, and we have to think that in order for the EU to integrate a potential member state, it has to have a very important economic capacity. And if it doesn't have this capacity, then I assume that it would be very difficult for new candidate countries to join the EU. And this, of course, depends on the size of the country and on other factors, domestic factors.
Robert Olds.
The EU has, as a result of various governments pushing for various agendas, wanted to look at expansion perhaps towards Morocco. Other countries have looked towards partnership programs with countries such as Ukraine and Georgia. My organisation, the Bruges Group, recently published a paper on this from a Russian academic, and really it was quite a balanced paper, but argued that the European Union's programmes had failed, partly because they weren't putting enough into their expansion programmes and putting in good enough deals such as with Ukraine. Ukraine at the moment can get a better trade deal with Russia and the CIS than it can with the European Union. The European Union has very restrictive quotas on Ukrainian goods, and that's really not a way of winning friends and influencing people. It really isn't helping the case of expansion.
But isn't the simple fact of the matter, despite the crisis that we've seen in Greece and all of the other economic difficulties facing the European Union, nonetheless, it remains still an attractive place that countries want to join?
Can I say something here?
Please do.
I think it's absolutely right to distinguish between supply and demand. It's not my impression that there are many countries that 4 or 5 years ago wanted to join the European Union who ceased to want to join the European Union. There might be some truth about that in the case of Turkey, because I think there is a view in Turkey that they're very economically dynamic and the European Union is less economically dynamic. That's not directly related to the Eurozone. That's a view which they've had for some little time, and there may even be some truth in it. But it doesn't necessarily follow that just because the European Union is growing less quickly than before, that it's not advantageous for a country like Serbia to join it.
Robert, essentially, Europe remains an attractive place that countries want to join. I mean, you may object to it for political reasons, but nevertheless, the economic reality is that it's a union that people want to join still.
Well, the case that Brendan talked about, the case of Turkey, is very interesting, because I think Turkey and the government of Recep Erdogan is playing a very interesting game. They're pretending that they're very much in favour of the European Union and trying to get the preferential trade deals with other EU states and with the European Union, whilst at the moment they've recognised that they don't really want to join. So I think there's a very clever game going on, and Turkey it's one of the few countries in the region that has a growing population, a growing and dynamic economy, so and they're viewing their future elsewhere, whilst of course teasing the European Union, which is in a sense playing the European Union's game against them, because it was formerly the case that the EU was offering candidate status and saying, make reforms and we might consider letting you into the European Union, when of course the political reality in the EU was that they'd really never allow Turkey in. Now it seems that Turkey is playing the opposite game.
I think there's a sort of reciprocity of dishonesty is a bit harsh, but how shall I put it, diplomatic fudging of the truth on both sides, both on the European side and the Turkish side. And I think that divergence is now becoming more apparent.
Athanasios, the reason why we're talking about this now, this question of expansion, is coming up obviously because of the Greek crisis. Simply put, is the current package that has been agreed with Greece enough?
According to many analysts in Greece and economic analysts, it seems that it's lacking a very important part which has to do with development. It seems that the focus is on austerity measures, but it doesn't seem to solve the issue of how Greece is going to turn back its economy into developing again. So I think that the problem of Greece will still top the agenda of the Eurozone countries for the next few months. And we still have to wait until some final decisions are made with regard to development.
Is it politically tenable within Greece? There is obviously a lot of domestic opposition to the austerity measures which have been announced. There needs to also be, as I understand it, a further 3 billion euros of cuts needed. 150,000 civil servants are losing their jobs by 2015. There is a lot of domestic opposition to this. It's by no means certain that it can actually be carried out.
Indeed. This is a very important question. We don't know the answer yet, because what we expect to have in Greece in the next few months is elections. And I think from these elections we will understand better whether the political system has the capacity to implement the reforms that the Eurozone countries basically want Greece to have. So it's still an open question whether Greece can do that.
But these reforms, of course, are reforms that are very necessary to the Greek economy. The euro, in a sense, is irrelevant to that. If the euro didn't exist, these would still be necessities for the Greek economy. So I think that needs to be put into the mix.
And indeed, the OECD has said that out of the developed economies, the Greeks work the longest hours, but actually they're one of the least productive.
There are many analysts who say that if Greece were not in the Eurozone, then it could devaluate its currency, drachma.
Even if it did want to devalue, it could only get some benefit from that if it carried out these liberalising economic reforms in its own area. You can't simply deal with economic inefficiency by devaluing indefinitely.
I mean, there are liberalizing reforms, as you call them, but at the same time there are reforms that have a great impact on the social cohesion of the country, and it's not certain whether the country can follow a sustainable path through these reforms.
Brendan, you think austerity, in the Greek case, austerity itself is not enough?
Well, I also think that, but that wasn't quite what I said. What I said was that even without the euro, there will be need in Greece of economic reforms, and I think it's desirable that they should happen. I think the eurozone as a whole hasn't yet got the balance between growth and austerity, and I'd certainly agree with that. But part of the difficulty there is that individual national governments aren't always very good at carrying out what they say they're going to carry out. And within the Eurozone, there hasn't yet been evolved a clear governance structure which will strike this balance. In national governments, you can strike the balance, or attempt to strike the balance, between reform and austerity on the one hand, and economic growth on the other. That's not a trick that the European Union or the Eurozone has yet worked out how to play. If they do, the Eurozone will be successful. If not, not.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Today I'm discussing the impact of the Greek financial crisis on EU expansion with my guests Athanasios Manis, Brendan Donnely and Robert Oulds. Is it possible to have a coherent fiscal and economic strategy in a union with such radically divergent economies? Robert?
No, it's not. The Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. It does not work. Countries that are in the euro, even if they do carry out these reforms and liberalise their economies, they would still have the problem that their currency, the euro, makes them uncompetitive, and it makes other countries overly competitive, which means that the economies of southern Europe, such as Greece and Italy and Spain, are flooded with imports, primarily from Germany, that are made cheaper by the euro, and their own producers in their domestic market cannot compete. So really the euro isn't an optimal currency area, and it's quite simply not working for them, which is why we see such high levels of unemployment. And this is of a great deal of concern to the Greek people, who are feeling powerless, so much so that even today there is a protest of Greek people outside the European Commission headquarters in London, in Smith Square. The concern is so great that they're even taking to the streets in London to protest in a small way. So really the argument is that power has gone too high to the European level, away from accountable governments that can respond to their people's needs and implement the reforms and have their own currency that's set at a value that suits a country's economy. With the European Union, we don't have that. We have a system where power is centralised and the euro is just wrong for them.
Brendan Donnely.
If we hadn't had the euro over the past 2 or 3 years, the European economy would have fallen apart in a much worse way than it has. If everybody's going to devalue, then there's no end to that process. It's something that's incompatible.
Well, Germany would increase the value of their currency.
Incompatible. Well, not just Germany. There's
the
a whole range
Finland,
of countries which would have been seeking what they thought of as being their own short-term advantage. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages of the euro, but it's wrong to imagine that a regime where everybody devalues all the time against everybody else is an ideal one.
Those that need it should devalue. Those not. German currency would naturally, the Deutsche Mark,
there's no objective assessment of who needs it and who doesn't.
Well, they can affect it via interest rates and independent national central banks. But what national governments can do is that they can introduce their own economic policies and not have such severe austerity forced upon them, in effect, by the European Union, which would allow economic growth.
But you won't be able to get the economic growth unless others refrain from devaluation at the same time.
Well, no one
It's
has economic growth in the Europe, so it's a lose-lose situation.
Well, it would have been even worse.
Countries that are outside of the European Union are generally better off than those countries within the European Union. So why countries would want to join is increasingly becoming less likely.
Though, to be fair, I doubt you would be arguing for EU expansion even if the economic circumstances were better.
Well, when there is an expansion of the European Union, there is always a further degree.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Say the word Europe these days and thoughts naturally turn to the crisis engulfing Greece, which recently received another bailout to stave off financial collapse and prevent financial contagion from rocking the entire European financial system. But looking beyond Greece, what impact is the crisis having on future plans for the EU to grow? Are its plans to expand further still looking solid given the Greek crisis? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Athanasios Manis. He's a PhD candidate at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Brendan Donnely is Director of Federal Trust, a pro-EU think tank. He's also a former MEP. And Robert Oulds is Director of the Bruges Group, a think tank that campaigns for a less centralised Europe. Robert, let me come to you first. Simple question. Is expansion, enlargement in the EU now effectively dead, at least for now?
Expansion of the European Union is very unlikely at the moment. Of course, they're taking in Croatia, but at this time being, the European Union is suffering economically. It can't be afford to be taking on other members, and really the divisions in the European Union are growing as a result of the EU's inspired austerity programmes, which are causing a great deal of harm amongst many nations' economies. So really expanding the EU isn't really an alternative, and countries